Well, hello, this is Hugh Tilson. I'm here having an unbelievably delightful reunion with a friend and colleague in state-level public health of over 40 years. Did I say that, Doug?
Yeah.
Dr. Doug Lloyd. You're going to get to know him.
It
was in the
1800s.
1800s, I think. Hugh Tilson here for the de Beaumont-funded, ASTO-supported University of Indiana Fairbanks School of Public Health project on public health success and leadership. I can't think of anybody better to talk with about that, Doug, so thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Hugh. Glad to do it.
Good. All right, Doug, thanks so much for doing this. This is good. Let's just start off with some recollection about you as a state health officer. As a state health officer, what does success mean? What is a successful state health officer?
Well, times have changed so much, as you know, Hugh. We have a situation now where most of the health officers are in super agencies. But I think one of the greatest parts of being a health officer in Connecticut is I reported directly to the governor, which was Tom Meskel and then Ella Grasso. And when she died, that was Bill O'Neill.
So what was success?
Well, we were very successful in many different ways. First of all, we had the first hospice in the United States in Branford, and I've been back to see that several times. I remember the day we got the call on Lyme arthritis. Pandy was my secretary, and she said, there's this woman on the line, she's nearly hysterical because of these large things on her. It was Lyme arthritis, named for Lyme, Connecticut. We were the second state in the United States to have a rate-setting commission. That was back in the days of certificate of need. Of course, they don't do that now. They negotiate with health plans. And we were the second state in the country to have an EMS system. Indiana, I think, was the first.
So, name the ingredients for your success. What was it about you and the setting that made you successful?
Well, it was interesting because at 33, I was kind of young. I use the word somewhat advisedly. I had a little bit of chutzpah. I wasn't afraid to get out there. And one of the things that I think is most important for a health officer, if you can do it, because you pretty near have to get the sign-off of the governor and everybody else, is to use the office of health officer as the bully pulpit, which means you get out there and you get on television and you're not afraid of TV, and you tell the people in the state what kind of, if it's a national problem, you talk about what's the state implications. And I did that quite frequently.
Let's talk about the biggest challenge you had. What was the toughest nut to crack as a state health officer? Biggest challenge, biggest scandal, toughest job? What was the biggest?
I don't know if you really want me to go into that.
I do.
Okay. You're gonna have to cut this one out. I got a call from Jay Jackson, who was in the governor's office. He said, isn't the medical examiner fall under you, Kathy Galvin? And I said, well, not really. They had reorganized the Commission on the Commission on Medical Legal Investigation, and because there was not, I was supposed to be ex officio, but because there was not a chair, Harry Gaucher had had a heart attack, I became the chairman of the commission. So Jay said, what about Kathy Galvin? Does she report to you? And I said, no. What's the problem? He says, well, there are people coming in here and saying that her dogs are eating human remains off the autopsy table. And so my first reaction was, oh, that can't be true. So I called Kathy up and I said, Kathy, it's time for a 10-year review. So the day that she was supposed to come in and see me, she had the flu and she didn't. So anyway, we went over there are no mountains in Connecticut, but we went over the other side of the ridge, Pawtucket Ridge, into Avon, and we met and we talked about it. And that was when some of the comments that came out, unfortunately, were not good for the press, because the guy from Yale said, well, if she does her job well, there's enough for the DA and for the dogs. That's a true quote. Anyway, what we did is we accepted her resignation. Dick Lynch was the district attorney and state's attorney, and he said we could accept her resignation, which is what we did. In essence, we fired her, and she. It's interesting that she sued all of us for $10 million, but small state, and we do the judiciary, and so my biggest challenge was not strictly the regular public health, but a scandal because of her. And as recently as a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to the guy we put in as medical examiner. It was Wayne Carver. Wayne Carver was a guy who was Miami who did all the autopsies at Sandy Hook. And it's interesting, that's one of the things we talked about here about gun violence. That's still a problem. You know, it was a problem then, it's a problem now.
So you learned an awful lot. Remember, we're talking to future state health officers. So talk about leadership lessons you learn when you have a scandal.
Well, first of all, I think I made one big mistake. I was a regular on Channel 3. I had a show called Dr. Doug, which was House Call. And I made the mistake of, I had those earpieces, IFPs. I made a mistake of taking the first question from Don Lark from Channel 3. The other stations were very, very competitive in Connecticut. And so when that happened, the press conference was over, you know, because they knew that I was being Dr. Doug instead of the representative of the governor. So I think you always have to be very cognizant who's in the State House, and you have to work with them. It doesn't hurt any health officer, no matter where you are in the pecking order, to get to know the legislators. They're the ones that make the difference on your budget.
Sure are. How old were you when you took your...
33.
33. So what do you wish you had known that first day when you came into the office that you didn't? What surprised you about being a state health officer?
The first day I came in, I remember it very clearly. I walked into the office and they had been withholding food and water from a bunch of nursing home patients. And so I was asked, is that murder or homicide? I think I said it was homicide, but I was very nonplussed by that one. But I think, let's talk about leadership skills. I had gone through, after I was a health officer, late in my career, the Leadership Institute. I wish maybe I had had that before I had started.
Let's segue to one of the other focuses of our study. We're looking at turnover of health officers who leave prematurely. How do you prepare an agency? Well, first of all, what was the impact of your departure in Connecticut?
Relief. No. No. Actually, when Ella died, Ella was being vetted by Jimmy Carter to be Jimmy's vice presidential candidate. And she died before that was finished. And so consequently, we really didn't have a shakeup. I remember the day that Bill O'Neill took over. He was sweating because we were closing 2 hospitals, Laurel Heights and Shelton. He kept everybody in that administration and 1 more term, and then he asked for letters of resignation, and of course we submitted them. I sort of rambled around for a while. The first thing I did was clinical trials in Hartford, and I had to leave that one because I had worked with a guy. I didn't particularly trust him. He was a doctor. I went ahead and we were doing a clinical trial on a woman. She had a history of cardiac disease, and I said, you can't put her in the study. And he said, okay. So unfortunately he did, and she died.
Go back to the agency. So what difference does it make to the agency that you left?
Well, fortunately, I had some very good people that were working with me that were able to take over the agency. So I think the agency, and from what I've seen since I've gone back several times, the agency fared very well without my leadership.
Is there anything you can do to prepare an agency for health officers leaving? You know, they're leaving with very short tenure these
Oh,
days.
yeah. I lasted 13 years, which is a bit of a record at the time. Well, I think the thing that you have to do is you have to look at who your chief lieutenants are. Who are the people that are going to assume the responsibility for your agency? And you have to be sure that they're well trained, that they know about leadership, that they know about being able to approach whoever's the head of the agency and bring anything that is going to end up in the front pages, but especially anything that's going to be a health hazard to the people of the state.
Great answer. You went on to do some federal work, I understand.
Yes, I did.
What did you do?
Well, I did. After the clinical trials, I set up a course for judges to learn risk assessment. And in that time was the time of the Delaney Clause, which said if you find any cancer in laboratory animals, you have to ban it. So I set up an organization called the International Life Sciences Institute, which still exists here. And then after that, we set the federal. We had ILSI, which was still, and we set up the federal, panel for judges, because we found out that federal judges didn't know anything about risk assessment. And then after that, I ran into Bob Harmon, who I'd known as a health officer, and he offered me a job with HRSA, and I went to HRSA. And I was there until I retired in 2007.
I remember it as though it were yesterday, Doug, and what I want you to talk with me about is the relationship between the state health officer and federal agencies, particularly from your perspective in HRSA. What was the relationship with SHOs, with state health officers, and what do we need to do to help that?
Well, I think the relationship between the state health officer and the federal people is usually pretty good. I don't know what they do now, but in our days, we could get an EIS officer assigned to the agency. And there was no question, you might have a state epidemiologist, but the EIS officer is the one you went out. That's the one that went out when we had the case of Lyme arthritis, was the EIS officer. So I think the relationship with the federal agencies is extremely important, especially with the CDC.
Thinking back to your time as a state health officer, was there anything that the federal agencies should have done to help you better?
Well, there was a discussion at the time, and it's sort of not relevant anymore, but one of the problems with being a state health officer and having such rapid turnover is you don't really ever seem to get vested in a system. And the question is, I don't know if that's been solved since then, but there needs to be some system whereby a health officer gets vested in some system. It's very often, as you know, we go from state to state. I did not, but otherwise you're left without a pension. So I think that's something that has to be addressed.
And let's try to wind this interview down with some futurizing. I mean, you've been around a long time. What do you think the greatest challenges are for public health today, that is the new state health officers? What are they facing, and greatest opportunities?
Well, the greatest challenges, I think, is that you have to be fast on your feet, that you have to be current with, if you're not current with the literature, you've got to have somebody in your agency that's current with the literature. You've got to know you've got to be able to look into your crystal ball and predict the possibility of your next big problem. And it's probably also a very good idea to get around the state, as I did, and meet with the people and talk to the people out there and say, what do you think the problem is? Because that way you learn something that you don't really necessarily get when you're insular within the agency.
What about opportunities? Is there a big opportunity for public health these days? And if so, what do you think it is?
Oh, there's no question. After all, the name, it's the public's health. And the public is always going to need assistance. Now, we can't guarantee health. We can tell the people that we preach to sometimes what healthy habits are. We have to understand that people eventually have to take control of their own health. And what they really need a lot of help with nowadays is learning about the healthcare field, where we have so many different insurance plans and questions of affordable care and things of that nature. And, when the public wants to know more about that, the health officer should probably be involved.
Is there anything else what do you want to say to the next generation of state health officers who are going to be watching this interview? What message do you want to leave them with?
It is, without a question, one of the most exciting, rewarding jobs that you can have. Personally, you get a sense of satisfaction. You get the slings and arrows. Sometimes you get the arrows, especially when you do things that they consider maybe a little bit out of ordinary. But what you do is you get the satisfaction of serving the public. And to me, I'm not being patriotic, but I happen to think that's a very high calling.
I want you to think about gun control.
Oh boy, gun control. Well, gun control is something that I feel very strongly about for a reason. There are 350 million guns in this country. That's more than one gun for every man, woman, and child. Now, I'm not anti-gun. My brother's got a Glock. I went out and fired it with him. It's part of the problem is the guns get in the hands of the wrong people. We need to vet people much more closely before they get a license to carry a firearm. That right there is, I hate to say 007, but with a handgun, it's a license to kill. And you and I both know of our colleagues who think very, very strongly that gun violence is a major issue, and it still is. Maybe it won't immediately get there, but it'll continue to come up.
And what do we say to the people who get righteously indignant and indeed furious with public health people when we bring it up? So
well,
just think out loud about the challenge to public health, about speaking
I've done that in my own family. My brother, Pax, he carries a Glock, and he tells me to mind my own business on it, and so does his friends. You try desperately to show them the statistics, and you try to show them that it is a problem, and it's not a problem with guns. We don't have a problem with the hunter. We don't have a problem with the person who goes out and does target shooting. We have a problem with the guns in the hands of the wrong people. And with 350 million guns out there, we can almost guarantee that there'll be another Columbine or Sandy Hook or whatever.
So what do we do?
Well, first of all, I don't think we don't let our vigilance drop for a second. We continue at it. I think there was a gentleman who recently spoke here at our meeting, and he talked about what he was doing at his state, meeting with various gun groups and getting them to talk about lock boxes and things like that. So, there's a lot of things that we can do. I don't think in the next 5, with the power of the NRA and the people from Congress who take the money out of the CDC budget, I don't think we're going to get the Second Amendment was passed, not that everybody could have a gun. The Second Amendment was passed so that states could organize militias and not that everybody could carry a gun. That's why we have a Second Amendment. Now, Wayne Pierre of the NRA happens to think different about that, but I don't think we can let it off our radar screen. And the other thing, we can keep statistics at the state level on gun violence. It's just that the CDC can't keep statistics.
Any word of wisdom for the ASTHO alumni? What difference can former state health officers make?
First of all, I don't think we should, as former health officers, as former SHOs, we should ever forget the amount. Albert Einstein once said, "There is no such thing as knowledge. There is only experience." And we have had the experience, at least I have since the early 1970s, of an enormous amount of information. We can be helpful. And the one thing that I've learned this last year is that you may forget something for a little while, but if you see something, it triggers another memory. and then another memory, and then you remember about it. I call it the Purkinje factor because I remembered about the Purkinje fibers when I was going to have a cardiac MRI. So you're always going to be helpful. And even if it's pro bono, you ought to let yourself be known to your local, state, or county, or local health officer that you're available. And working the legislature, you know, we all have had experiences doing that. We can help. We can help if we're from out of state and we're new, like I am in Texas right now. You know, maybe it's a limited, but we can give them advice to the health officer. We don't have to be the guy out there, but we can give the advice to the health officer of how we would have handled it had we had the opportunity.
Dr. Doug Lloyd, the voice of experience, always willing to help and obviously still a great help. Thank you for joining me, Doug.
Thank you, sir.